A hand closed around Alina's wrist before she even saw him coming. She spun, heart slamming, and there he was, standing too close, smiling the way he used to smile before every bad night. Damien. She had not seen him in 4 months, not since she packed a single bag and left before dawn, and now he was here on a crowded street, gripping her arm like he had never let go at all. "You look surprised," he said. "Did you think I would just disappear?" "Let go of me." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. People walked past them without noticing, the ordinary flow of the afternoon crowd, carts rattling, a bell ringing somewhere from a shop door. No one was going to stop and ask if she was all right. No one ever did. "We need to talk, that's all, 5 minutes." His fingers tightened. Alina's mind raced through every option and found none of them good. Screaming would draw attention, but attention from strangers had never protected her before, only delayed things. Running was impossible with his hand locked around her wrist. She looked past his shoulder, searching for anything, anyone, and her eyes landed on a tall man in a dark green coat standing a few paces away, reading a letter, entirely unaware that he was about to become part of her escape. She did not think. She pulled free of Damien's grip with a sharp twist, closed the distance in 2 steps, and threw her arms around the stranger's neck. "There you are," she said, loud enough for Damien to hear, pressing herself against a man she had never met in her life. "I was starting to think you forgot about me." The stranger went rigid. For one terrible second, Alina thought he would push her away and expose her right there, and Damien would know exactly how desperate she was. But then, slowly, his arms came up and settled around her back, light and careful, as if he understood without being told that something was wrong. "Never," he said, and his voice was low and calm, the voice of someone used to being obeyed. "I got held up." Damien's expression flickered, confusion sliding into something colder. His eyes moved from Alina to the man holding her, taking in the fine wool of his coat, the polish of his boots, the quiet authority in the way he stood even while embracing a stranger. Whatever calculations ran behind Damien's eyes, they did not favor a confrontation. "I did not realize you were seeing someone," Damien said finally, each word clipped. "You know very little about my life anymore," Alina answered. She kept her arm looped through the stranger's, willing her hands not to shake. Damien's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might push the matter, might reach for her again the way he always did when he did not get what he wanted. Instead he glanced once more at the tall man beside her, some old instinct for danger warning him off, and stepped back. "This is not finished," he said quietly, then turned and walked into the crowd, disappearing between 2 market stalls as quickly as he had appeared. Alina did not move until he was completely out of sight. Only then did she realize she was still holding onto a total stranger, her fingers curled into the fabric of his coat. She let go so fast she nearly stumbled, and he steadied her with a light touch at her elbow. "I am so sorry," she said, breathless, stepping back and pressing her palms to her burning cheeks. "I should never have done that. I did not know what else to do. He would not let go of me, and I saw you standing there, and I just—" "You do not need to apologize." He studied her with an expression she could not quite place, something between concern and quiet amusement. "Are you hurt?" No, I'm fine." She was not entirely sure that was true. Her wrist throbbed where Damien had gripped it, and her pulse had not yet slowed. "Thank you, truly. Most people would have just walked away." "Most people did not have someone throw their arms around them in the middle of the street," he said, and there was warmth in it now, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Was that man bothering you often?" Alina hesitated. It was one thing to grab a stranger in a moment of panic. It was another to explain the entire shape of her past to him in the space of a few minutes on a public street. "It's complicated," she said. "But yes, he does not take rejection well." "Then perhaps you should not walk home alone." "I'll be fine," she said quickly, though the offer, gentle as it was, sent an unfamiliar warmth through her chest. She was not used to anyone offering to look after her without wanting something in return. "You've already done more than enough." He studied her a moment longer, as if weighing whether to argue, then reached into his coat and produced a plain card, cream-colored, with only a name written across it in neat black ink. Alaric. "If he troubles you again," he said, "send word, I mean that." She took the card, turning it over in her fingers. There was no address, no title, nothing to suggest who he was beyond the single name. Just Alaric. "It is easier that way." A faint smile crossed his face there and gone. "And you are?" Elena Marlowe." "Elena," he said her name like he was testing its weight. "I hope our paths cross again under calmer circumstances." "I hope so too," she said, and found to her surprise that she meant it. He gave a small nod, the kind of gesture that seemed to belong to a much grander setting than a busy street corner, and walked away in the opposite direction Damien had gone, his dark green coat disappearing into the crowd within moments. Elena stood there a while longer, turning the card over and over, before finally slipping it into her pocket and continuing on her way, her legs still unsteady beneath her. She did not know, as she walked the familiar path back to the small shop where she worked, that the man she had just embraced to save herself from her ex was not simply a well-dressed stranger passing through the market district. She did not know that the name on the card, Alaric, belonged to a man whose full title stretched across 3 provinces, whose family had shaped the politics of the realm for generations, whose face rarely appeared in public because he had spent the last several years deliberately avoiding it. She only knew that for one strange, frightening, oddly comforting moment, a stranger's arms had felt safer than anything Damien had offered her in the 2 years they had been together. The shop where Elena worked sat at the end of a narrow street, its windows filled with bolts of fabric in blues and golds, a modest place that nonetheless had built a quiet reputation for fine, careful work. She stepped inside and the bell above the door rang softly, and Margaret, the shop owner, glanced up from behind the counter with immediate concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Margaret said, setting down her needle. "Something like that," Elena admitted, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She debated how much to say, then decided the truth, or most of it, was easier than a lie she would have to maintain. "Damien found me." Margaret's face hardened instantly. She had heard enough in the months since Elena started working there to know exactly what that name meant. "Did he hurt you?" "No, he grabbed my wrist, but I got away." Elena did not mention the stranger, not yet. It felt too strange, too new to put into words. "I think he's been watching for me. I don't know how long." "You should tell someone, the city guard at the very least." "And say what?" "That my former fiancé spoke to me on the street. They will tell me there is nothing they can do until he actually does something, and by then it might be too late to matter." Elena had learned, over the years, exactly how little protection existed for a woman whose fear had not yet turned into visible harm. Margaret reached across the counter and squeezed her hand. "Then be careful, take the long way home, do not walk alone after dark." "I will." Elena managed a small smile, though her thoughts kept drifting back to the card in her pocket, to the calm, steady voice that had called her his without hesitation, to the strange safety she had felt for just a moment in a stranger's arms. She did not understand why the memory lingered the way it did, warm and unsettling all at once, but she found herself hoping, quietly, that she would see him again. The rest of the afternoon passed in the ordinary rhythm of the shop, measuring fabric, pinning hems, listening to Margaret hum old songs under her breath as she worked. But Elena's mind kept wandering back to the market street, to green wool and calm eyes, and a name with no last attached to it. She told herself it did not matter. He was a stranger, and stranger still was the fact that she had used him the way she had. He likely would not think of the encounter again once the day ended. She did not yet understand how wrong she was. Nor did she understand that the man she had clung to in desperation, the one whose calm voice had steadied her racing heart, held more power in this city than almost anyone else who walked its streets. She only knew that when she closed her eyes that night, it was not Damien's face that lingered in her mind, but the quiet, careful way Alaric had looked at her, as if her safety mattered to him more than any explanation she owed him. Outside, the city moved on unaware, carriages rattling over cobblestones, lanterns flickering to life as evening settled in. Somewhere across town, in a house far grander than anything Alina had ever set foot inside, a man removed his dark green coat and thought, more than once, about a woman with fire in her eyes who had held on to him as if her life depended on it. He did not yet know her full story. He only knew that he wanted to. And somewhere else in the shadows near a tavern not far from the market, Damien sat with a drink he had barely touched, turning the encounter over and over in his mind, anger curdling into something sharper. He had seen the way the stranger held her, the ease of it, the protectiveness. He did not believe for a moment that it was real, and that suspicion, more than anything else, was what worried him. If Alina had found protection, real protection, then reclaiming what he believed was his would take more than a few words on a crowded street. He finished his drink, set down his coin, and walked out into the cooling evening, already thinking of what to do next. A messenger arrived at the shop 3 days later, a boy no older than 12, out of breath from running, holding a folded letter sealed with dark blue wax. Margaret took it at the door, read the name on the front, and handed it to Alina with raised eyebrows. "Someone wants you at the Ashenmore estate," Margaret said. "That's not a small request, Alina. Nobody just gets called up to that house." Alina broke the seal with unsteady fingers. The letter was brief, written in a firm, elegant hand, requesting her presence to repair and alter a formal gown ahead of an upcoming gala, her name having been recommended by a client of standing. It gave a time, a date, and nothing more. "I've never worked for anyone from Ashenmore," Alina said, reading it twice to be sure she had not misunderstood. "I don't even know how they heard of me." "Word travels when the work is good," Margaret said, though there was a knowing look in her eyes that Alina did not have time to question. "You should go. This could change everything for you. A recommendation from that house opens every door in the city." Alina spent that night lying awake, turning the letter over in her mind the same way she had turned Alaric's card over days before. She had told no one, not even Margaret, about the man in the green coat, and she told herself now that there was no reason to think the two things were connected. The Ashenmore name meant nothing to her beyond its reputation for wealth and distance, a family so far removed from the lives of ordinary people that they rarely appeared in the streets at all. It did not occur to her, not truly, that the calm stranger who had held her without question might belong to that very name. The estate itself took her breath away before she even reached the front doors. It rose from manicured grounds like something built more for legend than for living, stone towers catching the morning light, gardens laid out in perfect symmetrical rows, a fountain in the courtyard sending soft arcs of water into the air. Alina clutched her sewing case tighter as a servant led her through wide corridors lined with paintings, past rooms she could not begin to guess the purpose of, until they reached a bright sitting room where the gown in question hung waiting on a stand. She was halfway through examining the seam that needed repair, murmuring measurements to herself, when the door opened behind her. "You came," a familiar voice said. Alina turned so quickly, she nearly knocked over her case. Standing in the doorway, dressed simply but unmistakably himself, was the man from the market street, Alaric. Except now there was a different weight to the way he stood there, a stillness in the room around him that suggested this was not merely a house he was visiting, but one where his word was law. "You," she said before she could stop herself, "you're the one who sent for me." "I recommended your work to my housekeeper," he said. "I did not realize she would summon you so directly, or I would have warned you first." Alina's mind scrambled to catch up. "Then this is your house, you live here." Something flickered across his face, an awareness that the moment had arrived where he could no longer let the confusion continue without consequence. "This is my house, yes. I should have told you who I was when we met. I did not think it mattered at the time, given the circumstances." "Who you were," Alina repeated slowly. "And who exactly is that?" He hesitated only a moment before answering plainly. "Alaric Sinclair, Duke of Ashenmore." The words landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. Alina felt the blood drain from her face, then rush back all at once, hot with embarrassment. She had grabbed a duke on a public street. She had pressed herself against him, called him hers in front of a stranger, clung to his coat with no idea that the man beneath it held more influence than half the city council combined. "I am so sorry," she said, the words tumbling out before she could arrange them properly. "I had no idea. If I had known, I never would have. That is, I still would have needed help, but I would have asked differently. I would not have simply thrown myself at you as though." "Alina," he said her name gently, cutting through her spiraling apology. "You were frightened. It does not matter what title I carry. I would have done the same for anyone in that position. You could have told me afterward, on the street." "I considered it," he admitted, a faint, almost rueful smile crossing his face. "But you were shaken, and I did not think announcing my title would have made the moment any easier for you. I thought it best to let you catch your breath first." Alina studied him, trying to reconcile the calm, unassuming man from the market with the title he had just given her. Everything she had ever heard about the Duke of Ashenmore painted a picture of someone distant and unreachable, a man who avoided public gatherings, who ran his estates through letters and stewards rather than presents, whose face was rarely seen outside the walls of his own home. None of it matched the quiet, steady man standing in front of her now, dressed simply, speaking to her without a trace of the arrogance she might have expected. "I should still finish the work I was brought here to do," she said finally, forcing her voice back into something professional, though her hands trembled slightly as she turned back to the gown. "If that's still what you want." "It is." He did not leave the room as she half expected him to, but instead settled into a nearby chair, watching as she worked. "You do this well. The stitching, I mean. My housekeeper says you are the most careful seamstress in the district." "Margaret exaggerates on my behalf," Alina said, though a small, pleased warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. "I only do what any careful person would do." "Not everyone is careful," he said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up. There was a distance in his eyes then, brief and quickly hidden, the look of someone remembering something he would rather not. "Careful is rarer than people think." Alina did not press him, sensing instinctively that whatever memory had surfaced was not hers to ask about, not yet. Instead she focused on the gown, on the delicate work of repairing a torn seam along the bodice, aware the entire time of his quiet attention, steady and unhurried, as though he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. "May I ask you something?" she said after a while, keeping her eyes on her work. "Of course." "Why did you help me? On the street, I mean. You did not know me. You had every reason to simply step away and let me handle my own trouble." He considered the question seriously before answering, as though it deserved more than a quick response. "Because you looked like someone who had already been let down by enough people," he said finally. "And because whatever fear was on your face, it was real. I have learned to trust real fear when I see it. It does not lie the way other things do." Alina's fingers stilled on the fabric. There was something in the way he said it, something that suggested his own life had taught him that lesson the hard way. "That sounds like the kind of thing someone learns from experience," she said carefully. "It is." He did not elaborate, and she did not push, though she found herself wondering, more than she probably should, what experience had carved that particular understanding into him. They spoke for a while longer as she worked, easy conversation drifting between the gown, the gardens visible through the tall windows, small observations about the city neither of them dwelled on for long. It surprised her how simple it was to talk to him, how none of the weight of his title seemed to press into the conversation once they settled into it. By the time she finished the alterations and packed away her tools, the afternoon light had shifted long shadows across the floor, and she realized with faint surprise that she had lost track of how much time had passed. "I should return before evening," she said, gathering her case. "Let me have a carriage take you," he offered, rising as well. "The streets are not always safe, particularly for a woman traveling alone." Alina thought of Damien, of the tight grip on her wrist, and did not argue. "Thank you," she said, "for that and for not making this stranger than it already was." "I am glad you came," he said simply, and there was something honest in the way he said it, something that made her believe he meant far more than the practical matter of a torn gown. As the carriage carried her back toward the city that evening, Alina watched the estate shrink behind her through the small window, its towers catching the last light of the day, and found herself thinking not of the danger she had escaped days earlier, nor of the work waiting for her at the shop, but of a quiet, steady voice explaining that careful people were rarer than most realized. She did not yet understand what was beginning between them. She only knew that whatever it was, it did not feel like anything she had experienced before. Behind her, in the sitting room where the gown had hung only hours earlier, Alaric remained standing by the window long after the carriage disappeared from view, turning over a thought he had not expected to have again after so many quiet years. He had built his life around distance, around careful walls that kept the world from reaching the parts of him that still carried old wounds. And yet here was a woman who had reached him without meaning to, without even knowing who he was, simply by being honest in her fear and steady in her gratitude. He did not know yet what to do with that. He only knew he did not want the feeling to end. The second summons came less than a week later, this time carried by a proper courier rather than a running boy, the wax seal pressed with the same crest Alina now recognized from the gates of the estate. She opened it at the counter of the shop, while Margaret pretended not to watch over her shoulder. The Duke of Ashenmore requested her presence again, this time to fit a second garment for a formal dinner he was hosting for visiting dignitaries. Alina read the letter twice, aware of the warmth rising in her chest that she tried, without much success, to name as anything other than what it was. "He asked for you specifically," Margaret said, not bothering to hide her curiosity any longer. "Twice in 1 week. That is not how these houses usually behave, Alina. Nobles send for whoever their housekeeper recommends. They do not request the same seamstress by name unless there is a reason." "It's only because the first gown fit well," Alina said, though even she did not fully believe it. Margaret said, clearly unconvinced, but she said nothing further, only smiled to herself as she returned to her own work. When Alina arrived at the estate this time, she was shown not to the sitting room but to a smaller, more private study lined with shelves of books, where Alaric was waiting, already dressed in the formal coat that needed fitting. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression shifted, a quiet pleasure he did not bother to hide. "You came again," he said. "You asked again," she replied, setting down her case. "Though I confess I am curious why a man with an entire household of servants needs to personally request a seamstress twice in 1 week. Would you believe me if I said the first fitting was simply excellent work that deserved repeating?" "No," Alina said honestly, and he laughed, a real laugh, unguarded in a way she had not yet heard from him. "Then I will tell you the truth," he said, sobering slightly. "I wanted to see you again. The gown was simply the easiest excuse." Alina's hands stilled on the measuring tape she had just unrolled. She had suspected as much, had turned the possibility over in her mind more than once during the quiet hours at the shop, but hearing him say it plainly still caught her off guard. "That's a very direct thing to admit," she said carefully. "I find directness saves a great deal of time," he said, "and I have spent enough years avoiding honesty about the things I want that I no longer see the point of continuing that habit." There was a weight behind the words that told her this was not simply about her, that some older wound informed the way he spoke now. She busied herself with the measuring tape, partly to give her hands something to do, partly to give him space to continue if he wished. "May I ask what changed?" she said finally, keeping her voice light even as her curiosity pressed harder against her patience. "You have a reputation, you know. People say the Duke of Ashenmore almost never appears in public, that he keeps to this house and lets his stewards handle everything beyond these walls." "That reputation is mostly true," he admitted. "For the last several years I have preferred it that way." "Why?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier ease. "I was engaged once, some years ago, to a woman my family believed would strengthen certain alliances. I did not love her, not truly, though I convinced myself for a long time that duty could stand in for feeling. When the arrangement fell apart, publicly and painfully, I discovered exactly how little the people around me valued anything beyond what my title could offer them. Since then, I have found it easier to keep the world at a careful distance. Fewer people to disappoint, fewer people who might disappoint me. Alina set down her tools entirely now, giving him her full attention. That sounds lonely. It has been, he said simply. Though I did not fully understand how lonely until a woman grabbed me on the street and called me hers in front of a stranger, and for one moment, standing there, I felt more real to someone than I had in years, even though she did not know my name. The honesty of it settled over the room like something fragile, something that could shatter if either of them moved too carelessly. Alina felt her own guard slipping, the careful walls she had built after Damien beginning to loosen in ways she had not expected and was not entirely sure she was ready for. I understand loneliness, she said quietly. Damien did not simply frighten me at the end. He isolated me long before that, slowly, in small ways I barely noticed until I looked back and realized how few people I still had in my life. Margaret is nearly the only person who stayed close through all of it. Then perhaps we understand each other better than either of us expected to, Alaric said. They talked for a long while after that, the fitting finished but neither of them eager to end the conversation, moving from careful confessions to easier subjects, books he had read, places she hoped to see one day, the particular stubbornness of certain fabrics that refused to hold a stitch no matter how carefully sewn. It was, Alina thought later, one of the easiest afternoons she had spent with anyone in longer than she could remember. It was nearly evening when a servant knocked and informed the Duke that a visitor had arrived, unannounced and insistent on being seen. Alaric's expression tightened slightly at the news, and he excused himself with visible reluctance. "Wait here if you do not mind," he said. "I will not be long." Alina did not mind at all, grateful for the chance to gather her thoughts, which had scattered considerably over the last hour. She wandered the edges of the study, glancing over the spines of the books lining the shelves, when the study door opened again, not with Alaric's return, but with a woman Alina had never seen before, dressed in fine silks, her expression sharp with curiosity as her eyes landed on Alina. "You must be the seamstress everyone has been whispering about," the woman said, stepping fully into the room without invitation. "I am Lady Vivienne Ashcombe, a close family friend of the Duke's." "Alina Marlowe," Alina said, offering a polite nod, though something in Vivienne's tone put her instantly on guard. "Marlowe," Vivienne repeated, as though testing the sound of an unfamiliar language. "I do not believe I have heard that name in noble circles. Are your family from the city or somewhere further out?" "I work for my living, my lady," Alina said evenly. "My family has never needed noble circles to earn their place." Something flickered across Vivienne's face, sharp and quickly hidden. How refreshingly plain-spoken. Alaric has always had a soft spot for plain-spoken people. It is one of his more curious weaknesses. She moved further into the room, running a finger along the edge of a bookshelf, her eyes never quite leaving Alina. "You should know, of course, that the Duke's attention rarely lasts. He grows curious about new things quickly and grows bored of them just as fast. I would hate for you to mistake temporary interest for anything more permanent." Alina felt her spine straighten, refusing to let the words land the way Vivienne clearly intended them to. "I appreciate the warning," she said calmly, "though I have not asked for your opinion on the matter." Vivienne's smile thinned, but before she could respond further, the study door opened once more and Alaric returned, his expression shifting to something cooler and more formal the moment he saw who occupied the room. "Vivienne," he said, "I was not expecting you." "I heard you had a new seamstress visiting rather frequently," Vivienne said lightly, though the edge beneath her words was unmistakable. "I thought I would introduce myself." "I see." Alaric's tone made clear the introduction had not been welcome. "Alina, I apologize for the interruption. Vivienne, I will speak with you separately if there is something you need." Vivienne held his gaze a moment longer, then inclined her head with practiced grace and swept from the room, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before her arrival. Alina busied herself gathering her case, unsure what to say. "I apologize for that," Alaric said once the door closed fully. "Vivienne has always believed she has some claim to opinions about my life. She does not." "She seemed very certain of her opinions regardless," Alina said carefully. "She is certain of many things that are not true," Alaric said, his jaw tight. "Please do not let her words trouble you." Alina wanted to believe him, wanted to let the warmth of the afternoon settle back over the room the way it had before Vivienne's arrival. But a small, cold thread of doubt had worked its way into her chest, and it did not fully leave, even as Alaric walked her out to the waiting carriage himself, even as he held her hand a moment longer than necessary in farewell, even as she rode back toward the city, turning the entire afternoon over in her mind. The warmth of his honesty tangled now with the sharp edge of a stranger's warning. She did not yet know how much truth lived inside Vivienne's cold smile, nor how much trouble that particular woman intended to cause in the days ahead. She only knew, as the carriage rattled over the cobblestones toward home, that whatever was growing between herself and the Duke of Ashenmore was no longer a simple, contained thing. It had roots now, tangled and complicated, and roots like that rarely stayed hidden for long. Weeks passed, and the visits to the estate became less about torn seams and formal gowns, and more about something neither Alina nor Alaric bothered pretending otherwise. He would send a carriage on afternoons when no fitting was needed at all, simply asking if she might come read with him in the study, or walk the gardens while he told her stories about the strange history carved into the estate's old stone walls. Margaret had long since stopped pretending not to notice, teasing Alina gently each time she returned from Ashenmore with color in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the weather. "You're happier," Margaret observed one afternoon, watching Alina hum quietly over her stitching. "I have not seen you like this since before Damien." "I feel happier," Alina admitted, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "It frightens me a little how much." "Why would happiness frighten you?" Alina considered the question carefully before answering. "Because the last time I let myself feel this settled with someone, it ended in the worst months of my life. I keep waiting for the same pattern to repeat itself, for the kindness to reveal itself as something else underneath." "Alaric is not Damien," Margaret said gently. "I know that, truly I do, but knowing it and trusting it are not always the same thing." It was during one of these quiet afternoons at the estate, walking the garden paths beneath the shade of old, sprawling trees, that Alaric finally told her the fuller truth of what had happened with his broken engagement, the story he had only hinted at weeks before. "Her name was Isolde," he said, his eyes fixed on the path ahead rather than on Alina. "Our families arranged the match when we were both very young. I told myself for a long time that affection would grow between us the way it was supposed to in these arrangements. It never did, not truly, though I convinced myself otherwise because duty demanded it. What happened? She fell in love with someone else, a man far below her station, someone she could never have married without scandal. When my family discovered it, they demanded I break the engagement publicly, to save face before anyone accused Isolde of dishonor rather than simply admitting our match had never been right to begin with. I did as they asked. I stood before half the court and ended things in a way designed to make certain no blame fell on her, and all of it fell on me instead. They called me cold. Heartless, a man who discarded a woman without cause. No one asked whether I had ever wanted the match at all." Alina listened, aching quietly for the version of him that had endured that alone. "That must have been unbearable." "It was easier than I expected, honestly," he said. "What was unbearable came after, watching how quickly people who claimed to care for me turned the moment my reputation shifted. Vivienne among them, in fact, though she has always denied that particular history whenever it is convenient for her to do so." Alina's step slowed. Vivienne knew Isolde. "Vivienne was Isolde's closest friend," Alaric said. "She blamed me entirely for the ending of that engagement, regardless of the truth behind it, and has never quite let go of that resentment, even now that years have passed. I suspect that is part of why she reacted the way she did toward you. Any woman I show interest in becomes, in her mind, another opportunity to prove I am as careless with hearts as she has always believed. The garden suddenly felt colder than the afternoon warranted. Does she have any real power to cause trouble? Elena asked carefully. Beyond unpleasant words in a study, I mean. Alaric hesitated, and that hesitation told Elena more than any answer could have. Vivienne has connections throughout the court. She enjoys influence, and she is not always careful about how she uses it when she feels wronged. I would rather you be aware of that than blindsided by it later. Thank you for telling me, Elena said, though unease had settled firmly into her chest now, replacing some of the earlier warmth of the afternoon. I did not tell you to frighten you, Alaric said, stopping and turning to face her fully. I told you because I do not want to repeat the same mistake I made with Isolde, hiding pieces of my life, until the truth arrives all at once and does more damage than honesty ever would have. Whatever this is between us, Elena, I want it built on something steadier than that. The sincerity in his voice loosened something tight in her chest, and she found herself reaching for his hand without fully deciding to. I want that too, she said quietly. I have spent so long guarding myself against exactly this kind of vulnerability. It is strange how much easier it feels with you than I expected it to. Strange in a good way, I hope. In a very good way, she said, and the smile that crossed his face then, unguarded and genuinely pleased, was unlike anything she had seen from him before. The smile of a man who had spent years believing he did not deserve this particular kind of happiness, and was only now beginning to consider that he might be wrong. They walked the rest of the garden in comfortable quiet, the earlier tension easing into something softer, though Elena could not fully shake the memory of Vivienne's sharp smile, nor the knowledge that somewhere in the city Damien remained unaccounted for, his last words to her still echoing faintly whenever her thoughts grew too quiet. This is not finished, he had said. She had tried in the weeks since to convince herself he had simply given up, that his pride alone would keep him from returning. But pride, she knew from painful experience, was rarely enough to stop a man like Damien once he decided he had been wronged. That evening, as the carriage carried her home once more, Elena watched the city lights flicker to life along the streets and allowed herself, cautiously, to imagine a future that did not involve looking over her shoulder, one where the warmth she felt at Ashenmore might simply be allowed to grow without threat hanging over it. She did not yet know how fragile that hope truly was, nor how quickly the careful peace of these last weeks was about to unravel. Not far from the estate gates, in a rented room above a tavern near the edge of the city, Damien sat with a folded piece of paper in front of him, a letter he had spent the better part of the evening composing and recomposing, until the words satisfied the particular cruelty he intended them to carry. He had learned enough in recent weeks, through careful questions and a few well-placed coins, to know exactly who Elena had been spending her afternoons with. The knowledge had not frightened him the way perhaps it should have. It had only sharpened his resolve. If Elena believed she had found safety in the arms of a duke, he intended to prove to her, and to anyone else who cared to listen, exactly how little that safety was worth. He folded the letter carefully, sealed it, and set it aside for the morning, already turning his mind toward Vivienne Ashcombe, a name he had heard whispered more than once in connection with old grudges against the house of Ashenmore. If there was one person in this city who might welcome an alliance against the Duke, and the woman who had captured his attention, Damien suspected he had already found her. The first sign of trouble arrived not as a confrontation, but as a whisper, the kind that traveled faster and did more damage than any shout ever could. Margaret heard it first from a customer, repeated it to Elena with obvious reluctance, watching her face carefully as she spoke. "They're saying you seduced your way into the Duke's household," Margaret said. "That you used your position as a seamstress to work your way into his favor, that you have designs on his title and his fortune. I do not believe a word of it, but Elena, it is spreading through the market quickly." Elena felt the color drain from her face. Where would such a rumor even begin? I do not know, but whoever started it knows enough true details to make it convincing. They know about your visits to the estate, how often you go, even some of what happens while you are there. The only people who knew those details, Alina realized with a cold, sinking feeling, were herself, Alaric, and the household staff at Ashenmore, along with one woman who had made her resentment plain the very first time they met. Vivienne. And behind Vivienne, though Alina could not yet prove it, she suspected another hand entirely, one that would take particular pleasure in watching her reputation unravel in public. She sent word to Alaric that evening, and he arrived at the shop himself the following morning, an unusual and immediately noticeable event given how rarely the Duke of Ashenmore appeared anywhere outside his own estate. His expression, when Margaret let him in, was grim. "I have heard the same rumors," he said without preamble. "I am sorry, Alina. This is exactly the sort of thing I hoped to spare you from." "Is it Vivienne?" Alina asked. "I suspect so, though I have not confirmed it. There is also the matter of your former acquaintance." Alaric's jaw tightened as he said it. "I received an unsigned letter yesterday, warning me that continuing my association with you would embarrass my family and invite scandal upon my house. The handwriting matched details I have since learned belonged to a man named Damien Cross." Alina's stomach twisted painfully. "He found a way to reach you directly." "He did, and I suspect he and Vivienne have found common cause in wanting to see us separated, for entirely different reasons of their own." Alaric's voice hardened with a resolve Alina had not seen from him before. "I do not intend to let either of them succeed." "What will you do?" "What I should have done from the beginning," he said. "I will acknowledge our acquaintance publicly, plainly, without hiding behind vague rumors that others can twist however they please. If people wish to gossip, they can at least gossip with accurate information." Alina hesitated. "Won't that only give the rumors more attention?" "If you confirm we know each other at all, people may assume the worst regardless of what you say." "Perhaps," Alaric admitted. "But the alternative is allowing lies to define you without any truth to counter them. I would rather stand beside you openly and let people judge the truth for themselves than hide, and let Damien and Vivienne write the story however they choose." The decision, once made, moved quickly. Within days, it became known throughout the city's noble circles that the Duke of Ashenmore had personally acknowledged his acquaintance with a seamstress named Alina Marlowe, describing her, in careful and deliberate words spoken at a small gathering of court officials, as a woman of considerable character whose friendship he valued highly. The announcement did exactly what Alaric hoped in some ways, stripping the wilder rumors of their power by replacing speculation with plain fact. But it also did precisely what Alina feared. Rather than settling the matter, it ignited a new and more dangerous kind of interest. If the reclusive Duke of Ashenmore, a man who had avoided public entanglements for years since his broken engagement, was willing to acknowledge a commoner so openly, then surely something more significant was unfolding between them, something worth watching closely, worth questioning, worth undermining if the right opportunity presented itself. "You have made yourself a target," Margaret observed grimly, a few days after the announcement had settled into common gossip. "Nobles do not simply accept a duke choosing someone outside their circles without complaint. Someone will try to use this against you both." Alina did not have to wait long to learn how right Margaret was. An invitation arrived at the shop, unusual in itself, requesting her presence at a gathering hosted by a court official she had never heard of, ostensibly to discuss commissioning work for an upcoming event. When she mentioned it to Alaric, his expression darkened. "That is not a genuine invitation," he said. "That household has close ties to families who resent my position at court. I suspect this is an attempt to draw you into a setting where you can be questioned, or worse, publicly embarrassed, away from any protection I might offer. Should I refuse it? You may do as you wish, but I would advise against attending alone if you attend at all." Alina considered the matter carefully. Refusing outright might appear as an admission of guilt, confirmation that she had something to hide, feeding exactly the kind of speculation Alaric had hoped to quiet. Attending carried its own risks, but perhaps, she thought, risks she could manage if she went in with clear eyes and steady resolve rather than fear. "I want to go," she said finally. "If I hide from this, they win regardless of what is true. I would rather face it directly." Alaric studied her for a long moment, something like admiration crossing his features. "Then I will accompany you." The gathering, when they arrived together several evenings later, was smaller and more carefully arranged than Alina expected, a room full of watchful eyes and polite smiles that did not quite reach anyone's expression. Vivienne was present, unsurprisingly, seated near the host with an air of practiced ease, though her gaze sharpened the moment Alina and Alaric entered the room together. The evening proceeded with careful, pointed questions disguised as polite conversation, subtle inquiries into Alina's family background, her education, her intentions, each question crafted to expose some perceived inadequacy in her suitability to stand beside a man of Alaric's position. Alina answered each one honestly and without apology, refusing to shrink under the weight of expectations she had never asked to meet. "You must find all of this rather overwhelming," Vivienne said at one point, her voice pitched just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Coming from such humble beginnings into circles like these, it cannot be easy, pretending to belong somewhere you were never meant to be." "I am not pretending anything," Alina replied evenly. "I have never claimed to be anything other than what I am. If that troubles anyone in this room, I suspect the trouble says more about them than it does about me." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the nearby guests, and Vivienne's composed expression flickered, just briefly, before smoothing back into practiced grace. Alaric, standing close beside Alina, said nothing, but the quiet approval in his eyes spoke clearly enough. The evening might have ended there, tense but manageable, had Damien not chosen that particular moment to make his presence known. He arrived late, uninvited, his entrance drawing immediate attention as he crossed the room with the deliberate confidence of a man who believed he still held some claim over the situation unfolding before him. "Alina," he said, loud enough to draw every eye in the room, "I did not expect to find you here, playing at nobility alongside your new patron." The room went utterly silent. Alina felt every eye shift toward her, waiting to see how she would respond, and beside her she felt Alaric go rigid with barely controlled anger. "You were not invited," Alaric said, his voice cold and level in a way Alina had never heard from him before. "I suggest you leave." "I have every right to speak to a woman I was once engaged to," Damien said, ignoring him entirely, his eyes fixed on Alina with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Unless, of course, she has already told you her own version of our history, conveniently leaving out the parts that make her look less like an innocent victim and more like a woman who abandoned her commitments the moment something more advantageous appeared." "That is enough," Alaric said, stepping between them fully now. "Is it?" Damien's smile turned sharp. "Perhaps the good people of this room deserve the full truth before they decide how much sympathy to extend toward her." Alina's heart pounded, old fear and new anger tangling together in her chest, but beneath both, something steadier had begun to grow in recent weeks, a strength she had not fully trusted until this exact moment. She stepped forward, past Alaric, meeting Damien's gaze directly for the first time since that day on the street. "You want to talk about truth," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Then let us talk about it plainly here in front of everyone. Tell them why I left you. Tell them what those 2 years were truly like, and let them decide for themselves whose version deserves sympathy." Something shifted in Damien's expression, a flicker of uncertainty beneath the confidence. But before he could respond, the host of the gathering stepped forward, clearly alarmed at how far the confrontation had escalated in front of so many important witnesses. "I believe this discussion belongs elsewhere," the host said firmly, gesturing for servants to intervene. "Mr. Cross, I must ask you to leave immediately." Damien's jaw tightened, fury simmering visibly beneath his composed exterior, but with the room's attention now firmly against him, he had little choice but to comply. He shot one final look toward Alina, a promise of unfinished business rather than acceptance of defeat, before allowing himself to be escorted from the gathering. The room slowly returned to its uneasy murmur of conversation, though Alina could feel the weight of curious and calculating glances following her for the rest of the evening. Beside her, Alaric took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "You did not have to face him like that," he said quietly. "I would have handled it." "I know," Alina said, "but I needed to face him myself. I have spent so long letting other people's actions decide the shape of my life. Tonight, at least, I decided something for myself." Alaric's expression softened, and beneath the tension of the evening, something warmer passed between them, an understanding that whatever trials still lay ahead, they would face them from this point forward, standing together rather than separately. But as their carriage pulled away from the gathering later that night, Vivienne remained behind, watching from a window with narrowed eyes, already turning her thoughts toward the next move in a game she had no intention of losing gracefully. And somewhere in the city, Damien nursed his humiliation with a growing, dangerous resolve, no longer content with simple rumors and unsigned letters. If reputation alone would not be enough to separate Alina from the protection she had found, he intended to find something far more damaging to use against her. In the days following the confrontation, an uneasy quiet settled over Alina's life, the kind of silence that felt less like peace and more like the pause before a storm finally breaks. She returned to her work at the shop, though her hands moved through familiar tasks with a distracted carefulness, her mind constantly circling back to the look on Damien's face as he left the gathering, and to the cold calculation in Vivienne's eyes that night. Alaric visited more frequently now, no longer bothering to disguise his visits as fittings or errands. He came simply because he wanted to see her, and Alina had stopped pretending she did not want the same. Yet even in the warmth of those visits, a tension lingered beneath the surface, an awareness that the peace they had built together remained fragile, contested by forces neither of them could fully control. "There is a gala in 10 days, Alaric told her one evening, as they sat together in the estate's smaller drawing room, a fire crackling softly nearby. "Hosted by the Crown itself, marking the anniversary of the treaty with the northern provinces. Every noble family of consequence will attend." "And you must go," Alina said. "I must, and I would like you to come with me." He watched her carefully as he said it, gauging her reaction, "Not as my seamstress, but as my guest." Openly, without pretense. Alina's pulse quickened, equal parts excitement and apprehension. "That is a much larger stage than the gathering we already survived. If Damien or Vivienne intend further trouble, an event of that size would give them far more opportunity to cause it." "I know," Alaric admitted. "I have considered asking you to stay away to spare you the risk entirely, but I do not think hiding you away solves anything. It only confirms to people like Vivienne that shame is something you should feel when you have done nothing to be ashamed of." Alina thought of the courage she had found within herself the night Damien confronted her at the gathering, the strength of finally speaking her own truth rather than letting others define it for her. "I will come," she said finally. "Whatever happens, I would rather face it standing beside you than hiding somewhere, wondering what unfolds without me." In the days that followed, preparations for the gala consumed much of the household's attention, and Alina found herself, somewhat to her own amusement, on the receiving end of the very care she usually provided to others, as tailors and attendants worked to prepare a gown suited to the grandest event she had ever attended. Yet even amid the fittings and careful preparations, an undercurrent of unease persisted, particularly once word reached them, through one of Alaric's household contacts, that both Vivienne and Damien had somehow secured invitations to the very same gala. "How is that possible?" Alina asked, alarmed. "Damien holds no title, no standing that would grant him entry to a crown event." "He does not," Alaric confirmed grimly. "Which means someone with sufficient influence secured his invitation deliberately. I suspect Vivienne's hand in this. She has connections enough to arrange such things quietly and clear motive to want him present." What do they intend to do? I do not know precisely, Alaric admitted, but I doubt either of them means to attend simply to enjoy the evening. Alina spent the following days turning the possibilities over in her mind, trying to anticipate every angle of attack Damien and Vivienne might attempt. Yet no amount of preparation fully settled the anxious knot that had taken up permanent residence in her chest. She confided some of this to Margaret, who listened with her usual steady patience. You cannot control what they intend, Margaret said. You can only control how you respond when it comes, and from what you have told me, you have already proven you know how to do that. This feels different, Alina admitted. That gathering was smaller, more contained. A crown event with half the court watching feels like walking into a much larger trap. Then walk in knowing exactly who you are, Margaret said simply. Let them try to trap someone who refuses to be ashamed. It is much harder to catch a person who has nothing left to hide. The words stayed with Alina in the days leading up to the gala, a quiet anchor amid the mounting anxiety. She spent time, too, gathering her own quiet resolve, revisiting old memories of Damien's cruelty not to relive their pain, but to remind herself exactly how far she had come since those days, how much stronger she had grown in the months since she first fled his grasp. 3 days before the gala, an unexpected visitor arrived at the shop, an older woman Alina did not immediately recognize, though something in her sharp, assessing gaze felt oddly familiar. She introduced herself as Countess Beatrice Farrow, a distant relation of the Ashenmore family, and asked to speak with Alina privately. I have heard a great deal about you, the Countess said once Margaret had discreetly given them the room. Some of it flattering, some of it decidedly less so. I wanted to judge the truth for myself. And what have you judged, my lady? Alina asked, more curious than nervous, sensing no immediate malice in the woman's tone. That you are precisely as plain-spoken as the rumors suggest, and considerably more sensible than most of the young women who find themselves entangled with powerful men, the Countess said, a small smile touching her lips. I knew Alaric's mother well before she passed. She would have liked you, I think. She always said the right woman for her son would be one who valued him rather than his title. I do not care about his title, Alina said honestly. I care about him. I believe you, the Countess said, which is precisely why I came. I wanted you to know that not everyone in these circles shares Vivienne's particular grudges, nor Damien's particular cruelty. Whatever unfolds at the gala, know that you have allies beyond just Alaric, should you need them. The visit left Alina with a small but meaningful measure of comfort, a reminder that the world she had stepped into, however intimidating, was not uniformly hostile. She thanked the Countess warmly, and the older woman left with a final piece of advice that Alina carried with her in the days that followed. Whatever they attempt, Countess Farrow said, remember that the loudest accusation in a room is not always the truest one. Sometimes it is simply the desperate one. The night of the gala arrived with a mixture of dread and determination settled deep in Alina's chest. She dressed carefully, the gown a deep, rich shade of blue that Alaric had chosen himself, and studied her reflection in the mirror for a long moment before allowing herself to leave for the carriage waiting outside. The palace grounds, when they arrived, glittered with more light and grandeur than Alina had ever witnessed in her life. Music drifting from open doors, laughter and conversation weaving together into a low, constant hum. Alaric met her at the entrance, dressed in formal attire that suited him with an ease she suspected few other men in the realm could match, and the warmth in his eyes as he looked at her steadied something anxious in her chest. You look remarkable, he said quietly, offering his arm. I feel like I am walking into battle, Alina admitted. Then let us walk in together, he said. Whatever comes tonight, you will not face it alone. Together, they stepped into the grand hall, drawing immediate attention from every corner of the room, curious eyes following their progress as whispers rippled outward like waves. Alina kept her chin lifted, her hand steady on Alaric's arm, refusing to let the weight of so many watching eyes shake the resolve she had spent days building. Across the room, near a cluster of pillars, Vivienne watched their entrance with a carefully composed expression that did not fully mask the calculation beneath it. And not far from her, half hidden near a side entrance, Damien's eyes followed Alina's every movement with an intensity that promised the evening was far from finished unfolding. The evening unfolded gracefully at first, formal introductions and careful conversation, music drifting through the grand hall as couples moved across the floor in practice steps. Alina stayed close to Alaric's side, meeting each curious glance with steady composure, drawing on every ounce of resolve she had gathered in the days leading up to this moment. For a while, it seemed possible that the night might pass without incident, that Damien and Vivienne's earlier scheming might amount to nothing more than uneasy glances from across the room. That fragile peace shattered the moment Vivienne approached during a lull in the music, a folded paper in her hand, and a look of practiced sympathy arranged carefully on her face. "I did not wish to disrupt the evening," Vivienne said, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "But I felt it only right that certain information reach the appropriate ears before matters progress any further." "What are you doing, Vivienne?" Alaric said, his voice low and warning. "Merely offering context," Vivienne said sweetly, unfolding the paper with deliberate slowness. "It seems our seamstress friend here was not entirely honest about the nature of her departure from her previous engagement. According to sworn testimony I have gathered, she left her former fiancé not out of any legitimate grievance, but after being caught in dishonest dealings that would embarrass any respectable household. Theft, in fact, from her former fiancé's own family." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the surrounding guests, and Alina felt her stomach drop, cold fury replacing the fear that first flickered through her chest. "That is a complete fabrication," she said clearly, refusing to let her voice waver despite the sea of watching eyes. "Is it?" Vivienne raised an eyebrow, gesturing toward the paper. "I have here a signed statement from a household servant who claims to have witnessed the theft firsthand." "Then your servant is lying or has been paid to lie," Alina said, "because nothing of the sort ever occurred." Damien chose that exact moment to step forward from where he had been watching near the edge of the gathering crowd, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling reluctant sorrow. "I did not want this made public," he said, his voice pitched with practiced regret. "I only ever hoped Alina would return the items quietly, without scandal for either of our families. It pains me that it has come to this." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, uncertain whispers beginning to shift subtly, the weight of accusation and denial hanging heavy in the grand hall. Alina felt the ground beneath her seeming to tilt, the careful resolve she had built over the past weeks straining under the sheer audacity of the lie unfolding in front of dozens of witnesses. "This is absurd," Alaric said, stepping fully between Alina and the gathering accusers, his voice carrying with the unmistakable authority of a man rarely questioned. "I have known Alina for months now. I have seen her character firsthand, and nothing in it suggests the kind of dishonesty you are describing." "With respect, Your Grace," Vivienne said, her tone dripping with false deference, "affection has a way of blinding even the most discerning men to the truth standing right in front of them." Alina's mind raced, searching desperately for some way to counter the fabricated evidence being presented so confidently before the crowd. And then, unexpectedly, a voice cut through the tension from the edge of the gathering circle. "I believe I can shed some light on this matter," Countess Beatrice Farrow said, stepping forward with the calm authority of someone accustomed to commanding a room. "As it happens, I took the liberty of investigating certain rumors myself, after hearing whispers of this very accusation circulating in recent days. I found the household servant in question quite easily, and after a brief but productive conversation, she admitted rather readily that she had been paid a considerable sum to provide false testimony." Gasps rippled through the crowd, attention shifting rapidly between Vivienne's suddenly pale expression and the Countess's steady, unyielding presence. "Paid by whom, might I ask?" the Countess continued, turning her sharp gaze directly toward Damien, given that the servant in question described the man who approached her in considerable and rather unflattering detail. Damien's composed expression cracked visibly now, panic flickering behind his eyes as the crowd's attention turned fully toward him. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "I merely wish to ensure the truth came to light, if someone else chose to fabricate details beyond what I asked." "Beyond what you asked," the Countess repeated, arching an eyebrow. "So you admit to arranging false testimony, merely disputing the extent of the falsehood." Damien's mouth opened and closed without producing a coherent response, the crowd's murmurs shifting now, sympathy draining rapidly away from him and toward Alina instead. Vivienne, sensing the tide turning decisively against her, attempted a hasty retreat. "I was merely presenting information given to me in good faith," she said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "If it proves false, the fault lies with whoever provided it, not with me." "Convenient," Alaric said coldly, "that the false information happened to align so precisely with your own long-standing grievances against my family." The crowd had fully turned now, no longer viewing Alina with suspicion, but rather regarding Damien and Vivienne with open disdain, the kind of swift and merciless judgment that noble circles reserved for those caught in obvious deceit. Alina felt her heart pounding, relief and vindication crashing over her in equal measure as she watched the carefully constructed scandal collapse entirely. "I think," Alaric said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, addressing not just Damien and Vivienne but the entire gathered crowd, "that the truth of tonight has been made abundantly clear. Alina Marlowe is a woman of considerable honesty and character, who has endured cruelty from this man," he gestured toward Damien, "long before tonight's fabricated accusations, and who has been the target of jealousy and manipulation from this woman." He turned toward Vivienne, "for reasons that have far more to do with old grievances than any genuine concern for my well-being. I would ask that this court remember, going forward, exactly whose word deserves trust and whose does not." The silence that followed carried a different weight now, no longer uncertain but decisive, the crowd's collective judgment settling firmly against the two conspirators. Palace guards, summoned discreetly by the host during the commotion, arrived to escort both Damien and Vivienne from the grounds, their protests growing quieter and more desperate as they were led away from the hall under the weight of dozens of watching eyes. Alina stood trembling slightly in the aftermath, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly draining away and leaving something rawer beneath it. Alaric turned to her immediately, concern replacing the cold authority he had shown moments before. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, taking her hands in his. "I think so," Alina said, though her voice shook slightly. "I did not expect it to end that way. I thought I would have to fight through that alone." "You were never alone tonight," Alaric said, "nor will you be again if I have any say in the matter." Countess Farrow approached them then, a satisfied smile on her weathered face. "I told you," she said to Alina, "that not everyone in these circles shares their particular cruelty. I am only glad my investigation bore fruit before real damage could be done." "Thank you," Alina said, gratitude thick in her voice. "I do not know how to properly repay what you did tonight." "Simply continue being exactly who you are," the Countess said. "That will be repayment enough." As the gala slowly resumed its earlier rhythm around them, music and conversation filling the hall once more, Alina allowed herself, finally, to exhale fully, the weight of months of fear and uncertainty beginning to lift from her shoulders. Alaric drew her gently onto the dance floor as the orchestra began a slow, graceful melody, and for the first time since Damien had first grabbed her wrist on that crowded street so many weeks ago, Alina felt something unmistakably like safety settle fully into her chest. "Whatever comes next," Alaric murmured as they moved together through the dance, "I do not intend to let you face it without me beside you." "I am beginning to believe that," Alina said softly and meant it completely. Yet even amid the relief of the evening's resolution, a lingering unease remained, quiet but persistent, a reminder that Damien's humiliation tonight, rather than ending his obsession, might well have only deepened it into something far more dangerous. In the weeks following the gala, the city's attention moved on quickly, as it always did, chasing fresher gossip and newer scandals, leaving Alina and Alaric to settle into a quieter, steadier rhythm together. Damien, stripped of what little standing his brief alliance with Vivienne had afforded him, disappeared from the social circles he had briefly infiltrated, and word eventually reached Alina, through Margaret's ever-reliable network of shop customers, that he had left the city entirely, seeking whatever fresh start remained available to a man whose reputation had collapsed so publicly and so completely. Vivienne fared little better, her family quietly distancing themselves from the scandal, her invitations to court gatherings growing steadily fewer until her presence in noble circles faded into something closer to memory than reality. Alina found, in the months that followed, that the fear which had shadowed her for so long slowly began to loosen its grip, replaced gradually by something she had almost forgotten how to feel, a sense of genuine safety that did not require constant vigilance to maintain. She continued her work at Margaret's shop, though her reputation had grown considerably in the aftermath of the gala, noble families now seeking her services not despite her association with the Duke of Ashenmore, but often because of it, curious to see the work of the woman who had so thoroughly outmaneuvered a scandal designed to destroy her. "You could stop working entirely, you know," Alaric said one evening, as they sat together in the estate's gardens, the last light of day fading into soft purple dusk. "You would never need to lift a needle again if you did not wish to." "I know," Alina said, smiling faintly, "but I do not want to stop. The work is mine. It always has been through everything else that happened. I would rather keep something that is entirely my own even now." "I would not want you to give it up," Alaric said. "I only wanted you to know the choice was yours to make." It was this quality in him, more than any other, that Alina had come to treasure most deeply in the months since their first strange meeting on the crowded street. The way he never once tried to reshape her into something more convenient for his position, never asked her to soften the parts of herself that made her who she was. He had told her once that careful people were rare, and she had come to understand slowly that he counted himself as one of them, careful not through coldness but through a deliberate, considered kind of love, the sort that respected her independence as much as it cherished her presence. Their relationship, once acknowledged publicly, settled into an easy rhythm that surprised even Alina, who had half expected the constant scrutiny of noble life to prove exhausting beyond endurance. Instead, she found that most people, once the initial curiosity faded, treated her with a respect she had rarely experienced in her earlier life, one not through her connection to Alaric, but through her own steady, unshaken character, on full display for anyone who had witnessed the events of the gala. Countess Farrow became an unexpected but welcome presence in Alina's life during this time, visiting the shop periodically under the guise of commissioning small alterations, though Alina suspected the older woman simply enjoyed the company and the conversation as much as any genuine need for tailoring work. "You have handled all of this remarkably well," the Countess observed one afternoon, watching Alina work with practiced hands. "Many women, thrust so suddenly into circles like ours, lose themselves entirely trying to fit an image they believe is expected of them. You have not done that." "I nearly did in the beginning," Alina admitted. "I worried constantly about saying the wrong thing, standing the wrong way, embarrassing Alaric simply by being myself in rooms built for people very different from me." "And what changed?" Alina considered the question carefully. "I realized that if Alaric wanted someone different from who I am, none of this would have started the way it did. He fell for a woman who grabbed a stranger on a street out of desperation, not a woman schooled in the careful manners of court. I decided, somewhere along the way, that trying to become someone else for the sake of fitting in would only insult the very thing that drew us together in the first place." The Countess smiled warmly. "Wise for someone so young." "Hard-won wisdom," Alina said, "but wisdom nonetheless." As the months passed, Alaric grew increasingly present in the daily fabric of Alina's life, no longer content with occasional visits and formal gatherings, but seeking out ordinary moments together, quiet mornings spent in easy conversation, Evenings walking the city streets that had once held so much danger for her, now walked freely and without fear at his side. He learned the particular rhythm of her work, the careful patience required for fine stitching, and would sometimes sit beside her at the shop in the evenings, reading quietly while she finished her tasks, content simply to share the same space. It was on one such ordinary evening, the shop quiet and closed for the day, lanterns casting warm light across the room, that Alaric set aside the book he had been reading and turned to Alina with an expression she had not seen from him before, something nervous beneath his usual composed calm. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the night we met, about how strange it was that something meant to save you from danger ended up bringing me the greatest happiness I have known in years." "I think about that often too," Alina said, setting down her work to give him her full attention. "I do not believe in coincidence, not entirely," Alaric continued. "I believe some meetings are simply meant to happen, however unlikely the circumstances. And I have come to believe, more certainly with each passing month, that our meeting was exactly that kind of moment." He reached into his coat, and Alina's breath caught as he withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring simple in design but clearly crafted with considerable care. "I do not want a life built on duty or arrangement, the way my first engagement was built. I want a life built on exactly what we have found together: honesty, respect, and a happiness I did not believe I would ever find again. Alina, will you marry me?" Alina stared at the ring, then at him, emotion rising so quickly in her chest that words failed her for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with feeling she made no effort to hide. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course, yes." The joy that broke across his face then was unlike anything she had seen from him in all their months together, unguarded and complete. And when he slipped the ring onto her finger and drew her into his arms, Alina felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the future stretching ahead of her held nothing but genuine promise. News of their engagement spread through the city quickly, met largely with warmth and approval, particularly among those who had witnessed firsthand the courage Alina displayed during the events of the gala. There remained, inevitably, some quiet murmurs of disapproval among the most rigid corners of noble society, whispers about propriety and station that Alina had long since learned to let pass without much weight. She had survived far sharper cruelty than polite disapproval, and she found she no longer needed the approval of every stranger to feel secure in her own worth. Margaret, upon hearing the news, embraced Alina with tears of genuine happiness. "I always hoped for this," she said. "From the very first day you started working here, frightened and guarded as you were, I hoped someday you would find someone who saw exactly how remarkable you are." "You saw it long before he did," Alina said, laughing through her own tears. "You gave me a place to rebuild myself when I had nothing else." "And you rebuilt it beautifully," Margaret said. "I could not be prouder." The wedding, when it finally took place several months later, was a smaller affair than many might have expected from a Duke of Alaric's standing, held in the estate's gardens rather than a grand cathedral, attended by those who genuinely cared for the couple rather than the full spectacle of noble obligation. Countess Farrow stood proudly among the small gathering, along with Margaret, who wept openly through the entire ceremony despite her best efforts at composure. Alina stood before Alaric beneath an arch of flowering vines, the same gardens where he had first told her the fuller truth of his past, and found herself thinking, briefly, of the frightened woman who had thrown her arms around a stranger on a crowded street so many months before. That woman could not have imagined in her most desperate moment that the act meant only to save her would lead here, to this quiet garden, this steady man, this life she had never dared to hope for. "I promise," Alaric said, as they exchanged their vows, "to be the kind of careful person you deserve for the rest of our lives together." "And I promise," Alina said, her voice steady and sure, "to never stop being exactly who I am and to trust that you will love me for it." As they were pronounced husband and wife, and the small gathering erupted into warm applause, Alina felt the last remnants of old fear finally dissolve completely, replaced by a certainty she had once thought impossible to feel again. She had come to this city with nothing but her skill with a needle and a desperate need to escape her past. She was leaving that chapter of her life behind entirely now, stepping instead into a future built not on desperation, but on genuine, chosen love. Somewhere far from the city, in a place he had chosen to disappear to rather than face the consequences of his own cruelty, Damien would eventually hear news of the marriage, carried through whatever remaining connections still bothered to speak with him. He would feel, perhaps, one final flicker of bitter resentment before the news faded into irrelevance, one more piece of a life he had lost through his own choices rather than any injustice done to him. Alina, for her part, gave him no further thought at all. She had built something far stronger than anything he had ever offered her, and she had built it, ultimately, through her own courage and her own choices, standing beside a man who valued exactly that strength above everything else. Years later, the story of how Alina Marlowe became Duchess of Ashenmore had softened into something closer to legend within the city, told and retold with small variations at gatherings and family dinners, though the truest version remained the one Alina herself occasionally shared with the young women who came to her, over time, seeking guidance of their own. She had built, alongside her work as Duchess, a quiet reputation for helping women who found themselves trapped in circumstances much like the ones she had once endured, offering resources and shelter to those fleeing situations as dangerous as the one she had escaped that day on the crowded street. People assumed the difficult part was surviving him, she told one young woman who came to her workshop seeking both practical help and honest advice, referring to a man whose cruelty echoed painfully familiar patterns. But the truly difficult part was believing afterward that I deserved something better. Escaping is only the beginning. Rebuilding yourself into someone who trusts happiness again, that is the harder work. Margaret's shop had grown considerably over the years, expanded and supported quietly by Alina's ongoing involvement, training young seamstresses who might otherwise have found no path toward independence. Alina visited often, never quite willing to let go entirely of the place that had given her shelter during her most desperate months, and Margaret, though older now, still greeted her with the same warm affection she always had. "You never did stop being exactly who you were," Margaret observed one afternoon, watching Alina instruct a young apprentice with the same careful patience she had once received herself. "Even with a title now attached to your name." "Why would I stop?" Alina said, smiling. "That woman is the one Alaric fell in love with. I have no intention of losing her, no matter how many years pass." Alaric, for his part, had grown into his role with a confidence Alina had watched develop steadily over the years. No longer the quietly guarded man who avoided public life, but someone who used his considerable influence deliberately, championing causes that mattered to them both, particularly protections for women facing situations like the one Alina had once fled. Their partnership, built originally on an act of desperate improvisation on a crowded street, had grown into something neither of them could have predicted that day. A genuine, equal alliance built on mutual respect rather than convenient arrangement. Countess Farrow remained a cherished presence in their lives until her passing many years later, having lived long enough to see 2 children born into the Ashenmore household, both of whom grew up hearing the story of their parents' unlikely beginning, told with warmth and gentle humor, rather than any trace of the fear that had originally shaped it. "Tell us again how you met father," their eldest daughter would ask, curled beside Alina during quiet evenings by the fire, though she had heard the story countless times already. "I grabbed a stranger on the street because I was frightened," Alina would say, the old fear long since transformed into something she could recount with genuine fondness now. "And it turned out that stranger was the kindest man I had ever met." "And you did not know he was a duke?" "Not until several days later," Alina would say, laughing at the memory. "I nearly fainted from embarrassment when I found out." "Would you have still done it if you had known?" Alina would consider the question each time as though hearing it for the first time, though her answer never changed. "I would have done exactly the same thing," she would say. Sometimes the moments that frighten us most turn out to be the very ones that save us, in ways we could never have predicted. Looking back across the years, Alina often marveled at how completely different her life had become from the frightened woman who once walked the city streets glancing constantly over her shoulder, waiting for danger to find her again. She had built, instead, a life defined not by the fear she had escaped, but by the courage she had discovered within herself along the way, courage that had carried her through public scandal, through the schemes of jealous rivals, through the lingering shadow of a man who had once tried to control every part of her existence. Alaric had once told her in the earliest days of their acquaintance that careful people were rarer than most realized. Alina had come to understand over the years that followed that the truest carefulness was not caution born of fear, but the deliberate, patient kind that chose honesty over convenience, respect over control, and genuine partnership over hollow arrangement. It was this understanding, more than any title or fortune, that had transformed a desperate embrace between two strangers into a lifetime built on genuine, unshakable love. And so the story that began with fear on a crowded street ended, many years later, exactly as it should have, with a woman who had once run from danger now standing firmly, proudly, in a life she had built with her own courage, beside a man who had recognized her worth from the very first frightened moment they met, long before either of them understood how deeply that single act of desperation would come to shape the rest of their lives.